So one of the things I mentioned at the beginning of Mass is today is the anniversary of the Blessed Mother appearing to three little children. They were shepherd children at Fatima in Portugal. And one of the great concerns on the heart of our mother at the time, the Blessed Mother, was that she was concerned about an air she called of Russia at the time that was going to spread across the whole world. And that air was manifest on the last day of her apparition. So her first apparition was on May 13th, 1917. That was the first time she appeared to the children. And she appeared every day on the 13th of each month until her last time that she appeared to the three children on October 13th, 1917. So that would have been May 13th, June 13th, July 13th, not August 13th for a variety of reasons, but September 13th, and then finally on October 13th, for the last time Mary appeared to these three little children. And during the third time that she appeared, there were 70,000 people that had gathered around the children, and a lot of them were skeptical, non-believers, who thought these children were just making up this story of this beautiful lady appearing to them. And so they all gathered because apparently the lady promised there would be this great miracle on the last day, so that everyone would believe that the children weren't just making this up. So you have all the adults looking at these little kids and saying it's a bunch of fables, it's in their fantasy and their imaginations and the like. And Mary telling the children, no, I'm real and I will perform a miracle. And the miracle that happened was the sun came out. It was raining very strongly in torrents of rain on the final day of the apparition. And Mary appeared, and as she appeared, the clouds broke and the sun started to come out. And during the apparition, Mary looked up, as the children describe it, she looked up at the sun, and she held up her hand like this to the sun, and the sun all of a sudden started dancing in the sky. And everyone there, 70,000 people, were able to look at the sun without it hurting their eyes. If you look at the sun, it will burn your eye out. It'll burn the retina, the back of your eyeball out, because it's so powerful. But this day, miraculously, everyone could look at the sun, and it was dancing, and it seemed to break out of its little area there and start dancing around and turning colors, purple and green and blue and orange. And this went on for about 10 minutes, when all of a sudden the sun started to come towards the people. And they all started running because they were afraid that the sun was going to crash into the earth as it left its orbit in the sky. And it kept coming, and so the people are screaming and yelling, and it's the end of the world. And at the end of all of that, the sun came down quite far, but then all of a sudden it started to go back to its proper orbit. And once the sun got back, everything that had been soaked in rain was dry as though it had never rained before. The sun completely dried everything out. And that was reported in all the secular, atheistic, agnostic newspapers because people were there, everyone saw it. Whether you believed in Christ or not, everyone saw this miracle. And it was Our Lady's way of trying to confirm that these 3 children weren't just making up fables or imagining this or trying to get attention to themselves or whatever else, a lot of things they were accused of at the time. That, in fact, Mary was appearing to them. And one of the things that there was a lot of things that happened during these apparitions. They're unprecedented in the history of the Catholic Church. We've never had anything quite like this before, where Mary appeared like this. One of the things that she was very concerned about, however, was she was concerned that Russia at that time was going to spread its errors across the whole world. And at that last apparition where the sun came down on October 13th, 1917, that same day in Russia, the Russian Revolution took place when the Russian atheists, socialists, attacked the castle of Nicholas and Alexandra, who was the Tsar and leader of Russia, and murdered the whole family and took over power. And when they took over power, it became communist Russia at that time. Socialism became communism, and it was atheistic communism. And that was the error that our Blessed Mother said could spread across the entire globe, was this atheism, this unbelief in God. And looking back on that, myself at least, and trying to make sense of that, what does that mean? What's the great concern here? Well, one of the great concerns is that socialism is not just a body of thought in a book. It's actually a poison of the mind. Socialism poisons your thinking. That's what it does. It gives you a perspective on the world wherein there is no God, number one. Number two, heaven is something we create here on earth, because heaven, as we understand it, according to socialism, is nothing but us making up something beyond this life to help us feel better about trials, suffering, and the difficulties we experience in our lives. We just invented heaven because we basically had no other way to help ourselves feel better in the face of all these trials. Well, we're feeling pretty bad right now, but later on in heaven we'll feel better, and so we'll console ourselves with that. Socialism says that's just a bunch of baloney. We can build heaven right here on earth. And the way they did that was they killed a lot of people that they thought were stopping heaven from coming on earth. The socialists began their revolution and continued their revolution by killing people, millions of people. Joseph Stalin later took over the Soviet Russia. That was the communist government at the time. And during the 1920s, he literally starved 6 million Ukrainians to death, building heaven on earth, building heaven on earth. We have a problem here. We have all these Ukrainian peasants, they're uprising, they have all these crops, and they're upset because I, Joseph Stalin, ordered that all their crops and the fruit of their crops be taken away from them. Because we're building heaven on earth. And that's what he did. He went in, he took all the crops from these peasant people, wonderful crops. They harvested them, and once they had all the fruits of their labor, Stalin sent his soldiers in and took away all their food, so they had nothing left. And he took it and he sold it to benefit the state and make money for the state. And 6 million Ukrainians starved to death. They had a wonderful harvest that year, but Joseph Stalin, the premier, took all the food away, building heaven on earth, a new order. I'll redistribute this food where I think it should go, and this group of people is dispendable. We can dispense with these people. They're not that important. We're building heaven on earth. And see, every time socialism has taken up residence in the soul and mind of dictators during the 20th century, and there's a whole list of them. There's Stalin, there's Mao Zedong in China. He killed 10 million of his own people. Pol Pot in Cambodia, they called his field the killing fields, murdering people, building heaven on earth. We'll take this in our own hands, we'll empower certain people, we're going to make it better. And each time they've sought to make it better, they've only made it worse. And this is what Mary was, she foresaw this coming, and she warned us about it. And she warned us that faith in Jesus Christ is the remedy for this toxic poison called socialism, atheistic socialism on the human mind. Faith in Jesus, that we didn't just make up heaven. We didn't just make up heaven. It's not something that's a figment of our imagination. No, it's real. And that in this life, he says, you will weep and mourn. This is the valley of tears. It can be hard sometimes to live on the face of this earth. It's a fallen world that may not be so popular to hear, but it's true. But it's true not without a remedy, and that's Christ, who died for us. And even though we mess up, he still loves us. The socialist governments will not love you. They won't. They never have. That's their record. And it will only be faith in Christ that's going to deliver us all from this scourge, this poison, this toxicity of the mind that is represented by socialism. That's what it is. It's a poison of the mind. And it's coming across this land right now in the cancel culture, in woke culture. People have become awoke. They've awakened to the reality that, religion is just a figment of the imagination. We can build heaven right here now on earth. Let's get to work. And when you disagree with us, we cancel you. We write you off, and we don't listen to you anymore. We don't want to hear it. It's the same thing, It's just starting over again, see? So, one thing that's very hopeful in the midst of all of this, by the way, is Pope St. John Paul the Great was so delighted when the Soviet Union imploded as an empire. It completely collapsed in 1989 without a bullet being fired. That's Our Lady. No violence, no violence. It came down, and you know, Pope John Paul II wrote an encyclical in 1989 in which he refers to this Berlin Wall coming down. You know, the great Iron Curtain came down that separated us. And he gave his diagnosis of why the entire empire came down. And he attributed it to the fact that the human heart has been made for God and is restless until it rests in God. The atheism of socialism, he said, Pope John Paul II, was the reason why the entire Soviet empire collapsed. Because the people, when you deny them God, their hearts become so restless that restlessness in their hearts begins to visit itself on society, and the restlessness in society begins to tear at itself and is no longer sustainable. And all that restlessness just poured out into the streets, and the entire empire collapsed because of its atheism. And you know what? That's true, brothers and sisters. Our hearts have been made for God, and our hearts are restless until they rest in God. And Jesus has come to bring our hearts into the green pastures of the living God. And that's what Mary was saying at Fatima. There is this air afloat, this toxic poison called socialism that's getting into people's minds, that tells them there's no God, that's just a figment of your imagination. There's no heaven, there's no hell, none of that. We'll deliver you to paradise. And they haven't delivered yet. All they've left in their wake is millions of people dead, murdered, and destroyed. So, brothers and sisters, let's be mindful of the fact that we have the remedy here in Jesus Christ, who leads us to the green pastures. Our hearts find rest. And how valuable is that experience in life as we go through it? And recognize that in that rest, we find meaning for our lives. Because Christ is for us. And that means God is for us. And if He's for us, who really can be against us?